Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture, Part 2. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You will see the first one momentarily. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat. We do encourage participation in the chat throughout today's presentation. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes or a few more seconds before we get started, so sit tight and remember to respond to the polls when you see them. Here is your first poll. Go ahead and respond. If the poll function is not working properly for you, you can always put your answer in the chat.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of the 2022 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture. For those of you who were here with us yesterday, welcome back. Today we will hear from Dr. Angie Perron with her talk titled The Future of LGBTQ Caregiving, Visibility and Transformation. I'm Joe Himley, Interim Dean of the School of Social Work. Before I introduce today's moderator, I wanted to take a moment to share the history of the Winkelman family. The Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture was created in 1978 at the University of Michigan School of Social Work with an endowed gift from Stanley J and his brothers as a memorial and tribute to their parents. Stanley's father, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman's store in Detroit in 1928 with his brother Isidore. Stanley's mother, Josephine Winkelman, was a 1919 graduate of the University of Michigan's social work program. She worked at Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago. The Winkelman Lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and the helping professions in the field of gerontology, and for discussing the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services, and the delivery of social work services. Stanley J. Winkelman was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit. After the 1967 riots sent other retailers to the suburbs, he kept his family's department stores in the city, hoping that their presence could contribute to and sustain an environment suitable for doing business. Mr. Winkelman was very involved in social justice and social justice issues throughout the city. In 1963, as part of the Detroit Commission on Community Relations, he called upon the Detroit Board of Education to hire more Black teachers to further desegregate Detroit's teaching force. Stanley passed away in 1999, but his legacy lives on in the Detroit community and at the University of Michigan. We're thankful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides an opportunity to honor our alumni, Josephine Winkelman and her husband, Leon. As a reminder, today is part 2 of the 2 parts that make up the Winkelman Lecture. You're required to attend both sessions if you want to receive continuing education hours. I would now like to introduce Dr. Robert Taylor, who will serve as our moderator and who will also introduce our keynote speaker. Robert Joseph Taylor is the Harold R. Johnson Endowed Professor of Social Work and the Sheila Feld Collegiate Professor of Social Work. He is also the director of the Program for Research on Black Americans at the Institute for Social Research here at Michigan. Professor Taylor has published extensively on the informal social support networks of adult and elderly Black Americans. Dr. Taylor has been the principal investigator of several grants from the National Institutes of Aging that examine the role of religion in the lives of Black and white elderly adults. He has also been the co-principal investigator on several projects funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health, focused on the correlates of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans, including the only major study of the prevalence of mental health conditions among Black Americans, the National Survey of American Life. He has authored or edited 3 books and has published over 175 peer-reviewed journal articles. I will now turn over the floor to Dr. Taylor, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Taylor.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of this year's Winkelman Lecture, which has been going on, held at the University of Michigan since 1978. Angie Perron is currently a member of the 2021-2022 class of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellows Program. She is located at the National Academy of Medicine and the U.S. Senate. She is an incoming assistant professor in social work at the University of California, Berkeley. Among her many achievements, Dr. Perone received her MSW and PhD from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. She also has her law degree from Hastings Law School at the University of California, Berkeley. After 8 years of serving as an LGBTQ plus civil rights attorney, Dr. Perone became the founding executive director of SAGE Metro Detroit. Dr. Perone, SAGE Metro Detroit is a nonprofit organization that provides services, advocacy, and support for gay seniors and gay caregivers in the state of Michigan. At the National Academy of Medicine, Dr. Perone participates in the federal health policy process in congressional and executive branch offices and works on regulatory and legislative issues related to public health. We are extremely pleased to have Dr. Angie K Perron join us today for part 2 of the 2022 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Virtual Lectures. Her presentation is titled, "The Future of LGBTQ plus Caregiving, Visibility and Transformation."
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here. So I first want to thank the Winkelman family for providing the space and the resources to make this possible. Again, thank Dr. Robert Taylor. I also want to thank Dr. Ruth Dunkel and Dr. Barrett Ingersoll Dayton for their support and mentorship while I was at the University of Michigan and beyond. And of course, I can't give this talk without recognizing Dr. Karen Frederickson-Goldson, who presented yesterday, for all the work, the trailblazing work that she's done in this area as well. And I, of course, need to thank Emma Krasaniak and Tom Smith for their work behind the scenes as well. So I am going to share my screen. Give me 1 second to move to that. Emma or Tom, for some reason, it's not letting me share my screen. I don't know if it's possible.
You have
Just to save time, if you could just maybe share the PowerPoint.
Sure.
So I swear this all worked when we did this behind the scenes a few minutes ago or a little bit ago. But we've got a plan B in place, so we'll get this going. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right, excellent. Next slide, please. So I'll start off just really briefly, just with an opening about terminology. You can't give a lecture or a talk about LGBTQ plus anything without some brief note about terminology. So the terminology is ever evolving, and for the purpose of this, I'm going to use LGBTQ plus. But of course, there's so many different terms that folks identify with, especially in the older adult community. Next slide, please. So I'll start off with my first poll question. When did SAGE USA formally adopt the word queer for older adults? Now, as background, SAGE USA is the largest and oldest organization that serves this community. It's been around for decades. And I'm going to give you poll questions that are not quizzes or anything on sort of things that I'm talking about, but are related to the topics I'm going to be sharing, and sort of a more like, did you know, sort of extra sort of fun facts. I'll wait for the poll to conclude before I give the response and move forward. And of course, I do want to note that, this is not a homogeneous group, but the terminology can be important. Specifically, oh, here we go. We got, a good split. Interestingly enough, the answer is 2022. So this was after significant community involvement and conversations with a lot of different community organizations within the network, and they just adopted it in 2022. And the reason is because queer, while predominantly a pejorative word for many older adults, has actually, it's actually a really important identification for a lot of transgender and gender nonconforming older adults. So that is why they adopted the word queer, as well as older adults have started to become, have used that more frequently, and it's becoming more commonplace even with older adults. But with that being said, it's always helpful and important to ask individuals before we refer to them, certainly with this community and elsewhere. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. And so another important aspect that sort of sets the foundation for thinking about LGBTQ plus caregiving is the life course, and what does that look like? So I have to give credit for Dr. Karen Frederickson-Goldson and her colleagues for developing Iridescent Life Course. And then, of course, many scholars, including Patricia Hill-Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others who have really foregrounded intersectionality. And so together, what this means is this really underscores the importance of thinking about various aspects in ways in which discrimination, stigma, trauma, and also resilience and moments of resilience have impacted the life course for LGBTQ plus older adults. For many older adults, who came of age when a time when, during the Lavender Scare, or, during times when, you really face severe punishment for being out. So these have real implications for folks today. And the research really bears this out. There's emerging and growing body of research that shows the disparities, social, financial, physical, and mental health disparities for LGBTQ plus older adults. Stigma, bias, and discrimination are really intersecting in this community. So I worked with a group of Black same gender loving older men who talked about their experiences with discrimination and Jim Crow segregation, as well as being, or not being out, but just, being same gender loving or knowing that they were gay throughout their life. And this also has implications, of course, for help seeking. Many older adults, LGBTQ older adults in particular, there's research showing are less likely to seek out services for fear that those services aren't going to be culturally responsive. And so another important piece in thinking about the life trajectory, though, is key moments. And the AIDS epidemic is certainly one of those key moments and key events. And this has a profound impact in a couple of different ways. One is the devastation and loss that many community members experience, which have been re-triggered during the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, which is really relevant to caregiving here, is the ways in which support networks were developed in really creative ways. And families of choice or non-biological kin really came together and supported each other across gender, across age, across race, because there weren't formal networks of support and care, particularly at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So families of choice are really important in this community. Next slide, please. Another important component of thinking about caregiving is beyond sort of health and sort of immediate health and health needs, are thinking about housing and health needs that relate to housing. And again, this is sort of thinking of it from a structural systems lens. So what does this mean? It means that when LGBTQ plus older adults are aging and need services, they need to be culturally responsive services, and they need to have services with culturally responsive care providers. That includes not just individuals in sort of immediate obvious spaces of sort of case management, but also just in thinking about housing and things that are related to these new transportation of these sort of structural forms of and ways in which care is delivered. Another really important aspect about thinking about caregiving sort of now and in the future are thinking about social determinants of health, or as some people say, drivers of health, beyond healthcare. And so health disparities, as we know, are driven by not just one's immediate health, but by the structural inequities that create the living circumstances that we live in, such as housing and transportation and all sorts of different things. And so we are at a time when social determinants of health are really being foregrounded in exciting ways. But we still need to push the conversation forward to make sure that those in practice are still including these structural sorts of elements that really do impact health and caregiving. So this is a plug. I'm going to give a big plug for social work here. I think social work does have a real important place here in this intervention. And I would say for a number of reasons. One, social workers are trained to think in terms of systems, often work in the communities we serve, often are members of the communities we serve. And unlike other professions, social work has a core and unique mission and value focused on social justice. And so where social determinants of health is, we're starting to see a lot more conversation beyond sort of academia and really in policy spaces and practice spaces. Social workers are really primed and in a great space to help contribute to these conversations in ways that can really push these dialogues forward. And then I'll give you a couple of examples from my field experience or my practice experience as a community-based social worker. When I was working at Sage Metro Detroit, we had, during the pandemic, foods, and many of you probably experienced this in your own work, but food scarcity was a big issue. And particularly in the beginning, you had to actually go to a particular location to pick up food. So for many folks, that was really hard, especially a lot of the older adults we served who had mobility issues, transportation and equity issues, just couldn't go and get the food that they needed. So, and the same thing happened in Flint with the water crisis, where people were initially clean bottled water was dropped off at these, these pickup locations. But if you didn't have access to get to those you didn't get clean water, or you had to have someone pick it up for you. So these are ways that social work can really, increase, these points of access and equity in the conversation. And this was something that we saw really pronounced at Sage Metro Detroit, where I worked, for LGBTQ older adults in the Detroit region. Next slide, please. All right, another area that is exciting in thinking about present day caregiving and future caregiving is the opportunities to move beyond ADLs and IADLs. And so for folks in the lecture who aren't familiar with these terms, ADLs are activities of daily living. IADLs are instrumental activities of daily living. And ADLs are primarily sort of your help and caregiving with bathing, feeding, dressing, grooming, helping someone go to the bathroom. IADLs are things like cooking, cleaning, shopping, helping with finances, transportation, medications, communications. And caregiving has long included this concept of caregiving beyond these ADLs and IADLs. But as we are moving forward and thinking about broader ways in which caregiving is delivered, we as social workers can really, again, push the conversation beyond thinking about ADLs and IADLs. And this is really important for LGBTQ plus older adults, where in addition to all of that type of caregiving, there's also a really important aspect of psychological and emotional support that's provided by caregivers. And not surprisingly, folks who provide this really critical emotional and psychological support and caregiving don't often perceive themselves as caregivers. And so it's still work, and emotional support is labor. And it may be a labor of love, but it's still labor, it's still work. And so we're at a great time where we can start recognizing that as caregiving. And that's, it really is something that LGBTQ plus older adults, and of course others, really do rely on for health and well-being. And then I'll just add that LGBTQ plus caregivers comprise nearly 10% of the 35 million Americans providing care for older adults. And I would say that's probably a conservative estimate, given the sort of emotional and psychological caregiving that is actually quite common. So there are three main types of caregivers that I'm going to talk about. One, which is the first one, and I would say most common given the literature, is LGBTQ plus caregivers, or older adults who are caring for other LGBTQ plus older adults. This is incredibly common. So this would be maybe friends, families of choice, ex-partners who are providing care in a variety of ways. And the challenge here is that older adults in this space are also often navigating their own increasing health concerns and chronic conditions as they age together and experience what I call parallel caregiving. And that becomes much more difficult as older adults' health issues arise, which again, literature sort of shows there are disparities in this community, and chronic disabilities emerge sometimes sooner, especially with LGBTQ plus older adults of color. Now, the second group of caregivers are caregivers who identify as LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus, and are caring for someone else. So this would be like a gay son who's caring for an older or aging mother. And LGBTQ plus children often become the primary caregiver because there's this perception that they have more time and availability. And that's because the statistics bear this out, that LGBTQ plus individuals are less likely to have children and more likely to be single. But there's still this lingering perception that suggests that you are more available and have more time, and thus then, results in them often becoming the primary caregiver in a family dynamic. And another sort of challenging nuance here is that they may be providing care for an older adult or a parent or family member who never really accepted their identity or their partner. And so there's all sorts of complicated nuances there. And the third group I'll talk about, or I'll mention, are non-LGBTQ plus caregivers caring for LGBTQ plus older adults. And this could include a neighbor caring for an isolated older gay man next door. And these individuals can be lifelines and really critical pieces of or sources of support. However, they may also struggle with finding resources because it sometimes is hard to find these resources outside of word of mouth LGBTQ plus circles. So if you're not in that network, it can be hard to find those resources. I think we're trying to do better about that, but it is still a reality. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm now going to distinguish two different types of caregiving. One is caregiving in the community, and the other is institutional caregiving, and talk about how they sort of apply in LGBTQ plus lens. So caregiving in the community really breaks down into two different components. There's home and community-based services in sort of the health services area, and then human services area. And health services would include things like home health care, durable medical equipment, case management, personal care, or hospice. Whereas human services really is more sort of caregiving that comes from senior centers, adult daycare, home delivered meals, personal care, other types of personal care, transportation, legal services like preparing a will, chore services, information and referral. And what's important about this of home and community-based services in the context of LGBTQ plus individuals is that there's a couple of different points here. One is that research, and part of some of this research was highlighted in yesterday's presentation, really underscores that there's a strong fear from LGBTQ plus older adults who are currently living in the community about going to institutional care for fear of discrimination, mistreatment, having to go into the closet, which is supported by research, or some research at least. There's not a lot in this area, but there's research that does support this. And so that's one point. And the second point is that, and I'll get to this in the next slide, is institutional care is actually more common among LGBTQ plus older adults for a number of reasons. So there may be a preference, a strong preference for many folks to stay in the community. And that is a really, nebulous term. What does that mean? Are you staying in your house? Are you moving in with other families of choice? But the reality is that there are many LGBTQ plus older adults that will enter institutional care for a variety of reasons. Of course, not everyone, but just the numbers, the research does bear this out. And then another point I'll add about this is that there's currently a community-based survey that's looking at this in the Detroit area, and finding some surprising and interesting results that show that the preferences are actually really complicated, and what it means to live in the community is not just living in one's home, but it may include a preference to move to a particular community, with tiny homes with other folks that, your families of choice. So there's a lot of different ways in which community living or caregiving in the community could take place in sort of interesting and new ways. Next slide, please. And then for institutional caregiving, so there was a research study that came out just this last year that showed that that LGBTQ plus older adults have a greater anticipation and need for nursing home placement. And it basically showed a higher % chance of having to move to a nursing home compared to heterosexual adults. And this was using, I think, data from the Health and Retirement Survey. And then I'll just sort of backtrack a little bit. When I talk about institutional caregiving, this can include just a whole bevy of things. It can include long-term care, so skilled nursing facilities, which is, could include long-term care, or short-term rehab. It could include assisted living as well. And there is some research really that has highlighted that older adults do experience mistreatment and have experienced refusal of admission, abrupt discharges, refusal to accept legal documents, restriction of visitors, misnaming and misgendering residents, and refusal of care. And I can tell you from my own research, I was interviewing a bunch of facility staff at a variety of different facilities. And at one facility, which was, I would say, would be arguably part of the, meets the gold standard of who I would refer an LGBTQ plus older adult to, because they had all the objective criteria in terms of training, non-discrimination policies, lots of support. I interviewed someone there, a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, who delivers frontline care and really personal and intimate care. And she was concerned. She expressed concern about bathing a gay man because of fear of contracting AIDS. And this was something I heard just a couple of years ago. So, you know, there is concern and it's legitimate. There's a lot of exciting change happening to reframe and train staff to be a little bit more knowledgeable about all sorts of issues. But the reality is that many LGBTQ plus older adults are returning to the closet when they go to these institutional care settings. And you know, there are lots of reasons to be concerned about that. But I'm a positive person. I'm going to sort of spin this in a positive, strength-based sort of way. So the pandemic has really revealed some significant fractures and challenges that were already very present in long-term care facilities well before the pandemic. And so I think we have an opportunity here, and I'm very optimistic we have an opportunity here to see some change. So right now, you know, if you work in this space, you can see everyone is really burned out and it's really challenging right now. But there are opportunities for, I think, a lot of creativity and interesting spaces where people are talking about how to support communities of color, how to support LGBTQ people, LGBTQ plus older adults in these spaces in new and exciting ways. Next slide, please. All right, so here is my second poll. How many long-term care facilities operate as for-profit businesses? And now I pulled this data from CMS, which is why you see the CMS logo here. Okay, oh, here we go. 70%. A lot of folks know this answer. All right, well, that is accurate. It is 70%. So, you know, this surprised me when I learned this. And I think what's, you know, why this is relevant and how I see this as being relevant for the LGBTQ plus community is, I certainly saw this, you know, working at SAGE, but there's a perception that this LGBTQ plus older adults are an untapped market for this space. And that's true in many ways. And it's great that folks want to actually, you know, there are some individuals and some centers or some facilities that really do want to include LGBTQ plus older adults for a variety of reasons. However, it's really, really important that staff are trained to be culturally responsive. I can't tell you how many times I heard, but we treat everyone the same. Everyone is equal. And as you all know, as social workers here, equality is not the same as equity. And so it's really important that staff are trained, and there's such high turnover in staff in these spaces, especially among the frontline staff, and for really, really complex reasons. But and some not so complex reasons, but the bottom line is staff we need to have the space and we need to support staff to get that sort of training to be able to serve this community well. All right, next slide, please. Now, the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about legal issues and challenges in caregiving for this community. So one, and this is a pretty significant one that still lingers today, is recognizing families of choice. So without legal documentation, you may not have legal protection. You don't need legal documentation, but it is especially important, I think, in this community. So there was an article, and many of you may have seen, or some of you may have seen it in JAMA in October of last year, that essentially discouraged advanced care planning documents. And it cited studies suggesting flaws in advanced care planning because they don't always lead to the same outcome that someone initially indicates in the document, the actual document. Now, again, we're social work, so we know systems, process, and one key piece of advanced care planning is the conversation that happens that is really, really important in thinking about and starting that process. And so the legal documentation, of course, is important, but the conversation is as well. So I will say, thankfully, there was a response just yesterday that I think pushed back on this a little bit in JAMA. So if you're interested, I would suggest you check that out. But the other reason why that was a startling position was that in the LGBTQ community in particular, legal documents matter and advanced care planning documents matter. And so when you have a community that's rights and preferences, and I say preferences loosely, but what folks want to have happen when they're in need, being perpetually denied even with the document, it becomes even that much more salient to have the conversations and the actual documentation if possible. All right, so the next little blurb I have, or the next little bubble, is focused on accessing basic services. I have to underscore this again, basic services. This still remains a challenge, a legal challenge and beyond. And I give you an example from my work as a staff attorney. I oversaw this elder law project and an LGBT elder law project. And we worked with a transgender older woman who had a broken bone. And she went to see a number of medical providers who would consistently say, we are not specialized to train. We're not specialized to treat you. These are people who could treat a broken bone. But for them, they saw her as different in a way that their medical training wouldn't have allowed them to treat. Now, I think that's becoming less common, thankfully, but it still does happen. And so that's just sort of a really important piece to highlight, I think, in this community that I think is especially salient and that still happens, I think, especially with transgender older adults and gender non-conforming older adults. And then, of course, the next step is accessing culturally responsive services, which I do really see as sort of more of the wave of the future. And then another key piece is financial concerns. This is a community that has fewer financial resources to coordinate care and help on a population level. And then, like many other caregivers, experiencing burnout and isolation that's real and has real health consequences too. Next slide, please. Thanks, Emma, I appreciate it. So I want to now pivot a little bit to thinking about some exciting ways in which the field is evolving in theory. And so there was an article a couple of years ago by Vanessa Fabre and colleagues that looked at and surveyed a bunch of different literature that was, studies and literature in LGBTQ plus aging, and found that there's an increasing use of theory, and sort of praised this in the literature as being important because it helps explain how and why. And this theory was also providing conceptual frameworks and new perspectives and voices of a population that has really often been rendered invisible in the scholarship. So this is exciting. I just pointing this out because I think this is another area where we can see visibility and transformation, not just in scholarship and this literature area, but the theory to practice space as well. I think that's going to be really exciting in the next few years. And we'll continue to move forward there too. Next slide, please. All right, caregiving beyond COVID. Can we imagine this space yet? It's challenging, but we are going to get there in some way, shape, or form. So research has shown there are a number of really negative effects of COVID, which, one is that it has re-triggered these traumatic memories and experiences of early HIV, AIDS epidemic and loss for a lot of individuals. There's another set of research that has shown that LGBTQ plus older adults have experienced more mental health concerns than non-LGBTQ plus peers. And then another study came out that showed higher unemployment and reduced hours among LGBTQ plus adults compared to the general population. Now, yesterday's talk also highlighted a couple of positive pieces of the pandemic for some LGBTQ plus older adults, including being away from bullying and not having to experience daily discrimination in a way that that could have some protective measures, protective benefits in terms of health. But we can't ignore that the COVID has had some real negative impacts on the LGBTQ plus community in specific and unique ways. Now, the future, I think there's what this means in terms of thinking about future caregiving, a couple of different things, or a few different things. One is that we need more mental health support, and this is not unique to this community, but given the disparities in mental health, it's certainly underscored. More caregiving is, the need for caregiving is just increasing. And so, that's sort of an obvious sort of outcome, but nonetheless, something that really does need to be stressed, and certainly something that both of these, actually, mental health support and caregiving in general, especially family caregiving, is certainly being highlighted in policy spaces, both in the federal and state level. And then the last piece, I shouldn't say the last, but a third piece is really telehealth equity and assistance in tech-related services. So we saw in the pandemic a really huge leap in use and a huge expansion in telehealth and waivers in ways that allowed social workers and others to be able to provide telehealth in new and exciting ways. Now, of course, equity issues remained and were huge and still remain. We have some infrastructure money that's going to hopefully come and address some of those issues, but people are still going to struggle with paying for broadband. So there's still going to be equity issues, of course, beyond COVID, even though we're addressing some of the challenges and structural issues, in a piecemeal sort of way. But the other thing that I think caregiving that's going to be on the horizon and thinking about caregiving is, we're going to need individuals who can provide assistance in tech-related services, which is a form of caregiving. So when you have a device, or you have some sort of software platform or something that is providing telehealth, or something else, even information referral, we're going to need individuals who, and we already have this need right now, but it's going to grow, who can actually translate and help individuals, older adults, actually use these devices and software. And we're also going to have LGBTQ plus older adults as caregivers providing that assistance too, because remember the parallel caregiving. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk just briefly about three aspects of, or three areas of state and federal policy. The first is the CARE Act that I think are relevant to LGBTQ plus caregiving. Now, the CARE Act, initially kind of termed Caregiver Advise, Record, and Enable, has been adopted in many states. And this requires hospitals to ask patients upon admission whether they'd like to designate a caregiver and then record that name in the medical records. They must inform the caregiver when the patient is discharged and give them sufficient training to perform medical tasks at home. And the most important thing about this is it can include chosen family. It's not limited to biological kin. Now, the Older Americans Act is another really important bill or law. It's a piece of legislation. It's passed and it's been reauthorized a number of times. This is the primary vehicle for social and nutrition services for older adults and their caregivers. So through the Aging Services Network, think like Meals on Wheels, senior centers, transportation services. HHS funds OAA, the Older Americans Act, services at over $2 billion a year through the Administration for Community Living's Administration on Aging, and more funding and is sort of funneled in these ways in sort of other aspects of policy. But the Older Americans Act includes target populations for services, including those in rural communities, those with severe disabilities, those with limited English proficiency with Alzheimer's and related disorders, those at risk for institutional placement, and those with greatest economic need or greatest social need. So for the last two categories, there's some additional definitions in the law that target low-income adults who are members of racial and ethnic minority communities and who live in rural communities. And so there's been some effort to include LGBTQ plus older adults explicitly in the definition of those with the greatest social need. And in 2020, this law was reauthorized for programs through 2024. And if you look at the bill, you won't see LGBT or lesbian or gay or any version of that in the bill. But I will say, as often is the case in policymaking, they were able to get some wins. In particular, it requires state and local aging departments to outreach to LGBTQ plus older adults and collect and report data for this population. And ACL, which the Administration for Community Living, which disseminates a lot of the funding here, is issuing guidance on how state plans, like the area agencies on aging, must conduct outreach and education. And I can say Michigan is doing just that right now. And then Build Back Better. I had a question mark. Build Back Better. You know, we don't know what's happening with building. It's sort of in this interesting space right now. But the most recent version of that bill included a section on family caregiver supports and defined family caregiver in a way that definitely includes families of choice and was really broad. So that's exciting. Next slide, please. This is my next poll. Is it true or false? Michigan has adopted a CARE Act. True or false? Oh, a split. It is true. So we did, Michigan did pass, it became the 25th state to adopt the CARE Act on April 13th, 2016, and it is called the Designated Caregiver Act. And Michigan has some really good language in terms of making sure that it includes families of choice. Next slide, please. This is a bonus poll. So what was the first state to pass a CARE Act? Was it California, Oklahoma, Texas, or New York? All right. Well, you will be shocked, as I was, to learn it was Oklahoma. Oklahoma passed the CARE Act in May 2014 and defines lay caregiver. It's not as great of a definition as Michigan, but it still defines it in a way that I would argue includes families of choice. So that's exciting. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to conclude with hot topics. So these are what, there's many hot topics, but these I think are some of the top hot topics in thinking about LGBTQ plus caregiving in the future. One, data collection. This is a community that's been extremely excluded in very significant and intentional ways in federal data collection. Now, you heard from Dr. Karen Frederickson Goldson on a really important study that she's been working on longitudinally for a long time. But we still need this data in the federal level and then state level too, because there is so much data that's gathered that is tied to services and funding that we don't have access to. So that's starting to change. And there's a lot of conversations in community groups and national organizations that are in contact with agencies, federal agencies, state agencies to really make that happen and are helping them to develop the culturally responsive language to use in those questions. So that's exciting. Second is culturally responsive care for transgender older adults. Now, I will tell you from my own research, I did notice, and there's not a lot of research on this yet, but I did notice a distinction in caregivers, formal caregivers in long-term care facilities who were perfectly fine providing care for LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual older adults, but really struggled with providing care for transgender older adults for a variety of reasons, but often related to gender or what they sort of were perceiving as sort of challenges with providing services for gender. Anyway, so that I think is a really important topic that is growing. Religious exemptions. This is something that these exploded after marriage equality. And what these are basically carve-outs and laws or regulations that allow individuals to opt out or say they don't have to follow a particular law if they have a particular religious or moral belief. And, you know, we have a strong tradition in our country of protecting religious liberty. So it's important that we have, you know, some protections here, but what's happened after marriage equality is that these have been used as a way to discriminate against LGBTQ plus older adults. And you just have to look at what happened right after marriage equality and the explosion of religious exemptions to see that that was predominantly what was happening. You can also look at the legislative history and see that's what was happening. So that's a real concern. And in the last administration, there was a huge, just real liberties taken to allow that to happen in healthcare spaces, to deny services for folks who really were in pretty critical care situations. So that was really alarming. We're starting to move back from that, at least from the federal agency level, but there are still states, a lot of states pushing this forward. And, as vaccine mandates have become a huge topic of discussion, and reproductive rights, they are really huge topics right now in other spaces as well. And the last area I'll mention is dementia. So this is an area that's getting a little bit more attention now in LGBTQ plus caregiving and aging, because we're starting to see more individuals who are out or have been out and needing care. And I'm thinking of a good example here of a transgender older adult who maybe transitioned later in life and is experiencing dementia, Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, and having some incongruence and some, there are concerns about, what in one moment from the next, what is their experience, what is their lived reality? And so how do you provide, culturally responsive services in that context? And so there's a lot of interesting conversations in that space too. So that concludes my, my talk, and I am really eager to hear your questions. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you and to share this, this information.
Angie, thank you very much. Again, that was a great presentation. We have a nice group of questions for you. But before I start with giving you the questions, and I just want to mention two things. So number one, please, if you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And number two, I also just want to thank our recently retired gerontology social work faculty. And there are three of them in particular: Ruth Dunkel, Barrett Ingersoll Dayton, and Letha Chadiha. So here's our first question. Could you please review the acronym for the CARE Act?
Sure, let me pull up my notes for that one. I don't have it memorized, so give me 1 second. So I just pulled up my notes. Can you ask me the next question while I look for my notes?
Yes. And so very early in your presentation, you mentioned legal documents were being refused. Mm-hmm. And you discussed those documents. The questions I have are acronyms DPOA, and then I have POA.
Yeah, so all of the above.
Okay.
So legal documents, and a lot of them were documents that should have been recognized, whether it be, durable power of attorney, and in different states, they call them different things, healthcare proxy, so I think, the important thing to take away from this is that regardless of what the document is called, whether it's for making medical decisions, whether it's for making legal financial decisions, whether it's for, even visitation, whether it's for, honoring someone's will at the end of life, they're routinely rejected in a variety of different ways. And so that's happening less, I think, than it was certainly when I was a staff attorney at NCLR, but it still happens, and really painful moments in one's life. And so I think the key thing here is, as social workers or practitioners, to be mindful of that. And I've seen social workers be incredibly creative and supportive when someone who's superior is denying access because of some interpretation of some document that's faulty. So I think this is a space where we can be really creative here, and I've seen it.
So don't worry about the acronym. We'll just have someone else look that up.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Don't worry about that.
Okay. I just found it. Sorry. I just found it. Caregiver, advise, record, enable.
Okay. Thank you. So why don't you repeat that?
Sure. Caregiver, advise, record, enable. Okay. And AARP has a lot more information on the CARE Act if you're looking for the sort of nuances of it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So can you discuss any types of inclusion or sensitivity training for, say, residents or caregivers? Do you know of any
Yes.
programs like that?
For residents, yes. So there are a few that are emerging. And I will tell you, the organization I used to work with, Sage Metro Detroit, was developing some programs for residents and facilities. Sage USA is likely developing something as well on a national level. And I think there's some synergy between the local and the national in terms of developing those. But there aren't, as far as I know, there aren't really famous, well-known models or trainings that are being used for this particular population. So it's an area ripe for development.
Okay, thank you. So when you say gender is an issue with culturally responsive care for transgender adults, can you just discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah, so what I mean when I say that is, and I was thinking of my own research, is so in thinking about when you're allowed to discriminate, when you're not, in certain spaces, particularly in the personal care arena, there is a possibility that you are allowed to discriminate or a resident, let me think it, so I can rephrase. So a resident may deny services, potentially may be allowed to deny services from a caregiver if they want a caregiver of the same gender or the same sex, and that is not distinguished by terms. It would be sex, but it's been interpreted in a way that means gender as well in the law. But that there's not like clear legal cases about that, but there's some that suggest that might be allowed. And there's a whole legal doctrine about that I'll spare you from. But so what I saw in my research, I saw folks who didn't know the law, but were sort of aware that maybe we could discriminate based on gender or sex, meaning we might be able to allow residents to have a preference in terms of their caregiver. And that has been really problematic in thinking about gender nonconforming caregivers as well as transgender caregivers, but also the flip side, and for transgender residents who are receiving care. So that's what I was thinking of.
Okay. So one of the issues that we know with both transgender population as well as other LGBT adults is a disconnection or being isolated from families. Do you know of any programs designed to facilitate renewed family connections, family support?
That is a fantastic question in terms of opportunities. I am not aware of anything that is happening on a national scale. There could be programs that are happening on a smaller scale. I know there are programs like that for youth that have been really successful and have been around for a long time, but I haven't seen anything for older adults, although that's a really smart idea. So another area that's ripe for opportunity.
Okay. Are there some caregiving programs that provide work-life balance support for both the LGBTQ plus caregivers and LGBTQ plus adults in assisted living and adult care homes?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I thought the question was going to go in a different way. So I think you're asking about work-life balance for formal caregivers who are providing care to LGBTQ and other populations. Whew, that is also a hot topic right now, because there is so much burnout with that community right now, and such high turnover. So there is a lot of brain power, I think, being spent right now to develop and continue to develop ways to support that workforce. I don't think there's been like the golden nugget that's emerged yet, but there's I think there's a lot happening in this space because it has to. Something has to change.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. Mm-hmm. So are there subsidies or grants to support admission, the high cost of admission to long-term care facilities?
Oof, yeah. So I think there's a couple of different responses here. So one is, if you're looking at private spaces and truly for-profit spaces that don't have any sort of Medicare or Medicaid funding, which is really, really rare, then that's, of course, a whole different space in terms of what subsidies they might provide, which they might do to offset, for marketing purposes, or, they might want to include a population to get another more of that population in. But in terms of the dominant group of these facilities, which really rely heavily on or use, Medicaid funding in particular, there are, I think, complicated ways in which it's financed. I haven't heard it talked about in terms of grants or subsidies, but I know behind the scenes, the folks who do the finances do a lot of, I would say, creative coding and clever coding that isn't just for residents as a whole, to really make sure that they can provide housing and services. I mean, the care is expensive, and they are making razor thin profits as a nonprofit or even for profit. So some of that is happening, but I think in ways that it wouldn't, at least what I've seen, it's not considered a subsidy or grant in the same way that you would see in other programs or housing. But that there could be another area where that is happening, but from my experience, I've seen it sort of happening a little differently.
Thank you. We only have a little bit of time, and we have a few questions. So I'm going to just ask you a few questions, and if you can just give us some quick answers. So number one, should there be a requirement for LGBT sensitivity training for healthcare workers, or is there anybody working on this?
Yeah, I think yes, but often when that is when there is a requirement, it's an unfunded mandate. So that happened in California. So what that means is it doesn't actually happen, because if you don't have funding to support it, people don't have the resources to do it. I think it would be nice if it was incorporated into a requirement, but it has to be funded to be effective.
Yeah. And could you just tell us a little bit more about the JAMA article in advanced care?
Yeah, so it was a short viewpoint article, so you can just probably read it. I think it should be accessible on their website. It was October 2021, and it was written by 3 MDs, one who was actually in a geriatric clinic, 2 that were not, that I'm aware of. And it was, I think it was just trying to highlight that, their experience of advanced care planning, that what happened and actually happened at the end was not what the document said. But they didn't really explore as to why that might be. And then they just jumped to the conclusion that that meant these documents were useless. So the viewpoint, or the counter viewpoint, which was published yesterday, I think has some good counterpoints to that.
Thank you. So do you think that, so I'll just repeat the question as it was worded. Do you think the day will ever come when Medicare will provide for long-term care past 30 days?
Yeah, so Medicare doesn't cover, it doesn't cover a significant amount of time in long-term care spaces. I don't know. I think Medicare, it's hard to answer. I think Medicare and Medicaid are really carved out, and I'm seeing this in this federal landscape right now. There's like turf where Medicaid has, parts of energy and commerce, and Medicare has other spaces in terms of, changing the law, and they're so entrenched. It's really hard to imagine anything in the near future that changes that without a significant overhaul. It's possible. I just don't see it in the near future without some big lever.
Okay. So again, just a few more questions. Have you identified any protective factors present for the LGBTQ plus population living in assisted living facilities?
I haven't. My research is not looking at assisted living, although that's a really important area that should be researched. So I think, I don't have anything to share from my own research there, but I would expect that there's some research on that area. that's emerging. There's really not a lot of research though in the institutional care and LGBTQ plus space, although I hope that changes soon.
Okay. And this is from one of our former grads. What do you believe are the top healthcare training needs? And by training needs, knowledge skills are providers to older LGBTQ plus clients / patients.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the training curriculum that I developed, which I thought were, so we had sort of the 101, which is really basic background. And then we had, you know, depending on where you are, you know, maybe you need to know about intakes and questions and how to ask. Maybe you need to know about in-person interactions and how to sort of engage in a culturally responsive way. We had telephone calls, and we had sort of the nuts and bolts in 6 modules. And then we developed like these core modules in particular areas that, you know, like social isolation, religious exemptions. I can't think of the top, because I think the course, I think it really needs to be comprehensive, but at least the 101, the very basic 101.
Okay, thank you. And I have one last question. That's a big question, and it may not be totally fair because it's not quite, it's not directly relevant to your presentation, but it's relevant in today's world. So any thoughts on the impact of banning books on the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I'm in general opposed to banning books, so I think that shouldn't happen regardless of the book, because it's knowledge, and knowledge creates discussion, whether you like what's in the book or not. I think banning and burning books about LGBTQ is so harmful for just obvious reasons that I wholeheartedly think is a horrible idea.
Yeah, I've seen some, I'm not going to call it research, but some information indicating that in a lot of places, roughly 70% of the books are about LGBTQ plus populations.
Yeah.
So again, I'm going to let that be the last question. I don't think I have any more. Thank you very much, Dr. Perone, for a great presentation. You, of course, make the University of Michigan School of Social Work look really good, and our joint program look great. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It was great to hear from everyone.